It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of all my toils. With an anxiety that amounted almost to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. This moment in Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein is legendary. It's the moment where the hopeful scientist, consumed by his passion for knowledge, realizes where this lust has brought him, wielding godlike power to create an abomination. It's also the first passage that Shelley wrote, putting her nightmares from the previous evening onto paper. And yet this scene, this quiet consummation of all of the scientist's efforts, is likely fairly unfamiliar to a lot of the people that know the name Frankenstein. In popular culture, this moment is supposed to be chaotic. There's lightning, there's thunder, there's whirling gadgets, and there's cries of, "It's alive!" So how did we go from this creeping, crawling dread of Shelley's story to the groaning green monster that we're familiar with in today's pop culture? And what does that say about us? Today, on our special Halloween episode, we are going to be following the tale of Frankenstein through centuries of storytellers and watch as it went from a tale born from a nightmare to being a modern myth. If you couldn't guess from the subject matter, this video is going to be fairly dark, including topics of death, depression, as well as the death of animals. Although I won't be discussing anything in graphic or particularly gory detail, I just wanted to warn you in case you want to skip this video and tune in next week. Frankenstein was written across a period of 2 years by the English novelist Mary Shelley. Her parents were both writers themselves, known for their deep investigations into philosophy and their very public political advocacy. With this kind of influence, Mary took up writing very naturally, dabbling in it for as long as she could remember. When she was only 16, she met Percy Shelley, another author who at the time was 21 and had recently separated from his first wife. Percy was a passionately radical poet who had already made a name for himself in romantic literature circles for his devout atheism, his belief in non-violence, and his belief in free love. He was basically a 19th century hippie, and Mary, who had been raised with these ideals, was immediately drawn to him. For a time, the two met secretly at the grave of her mother, falling in love, and as legend would have it, consummating their relationship on that very spot. That might be the weirdest thing that happens in this video, and that's saying something. Despite Percy's political proclivities, you should try saying that 5 times fast, Mary's father didn't approve of the relationship because of Percy's less than ideal financial status, so instead the two eloped in 1914 when Mary was still only 16. The couple traveled together across Europe, eventually landing in the mountains of Switzerland in the summer of 1916. There they found the company of another literary giant of the Romantic period, Lord Byron. Lord Byron was renowned for his poetry, but is better remembered for his, let's just say, scandalous personal life, which may or may not have inspired the character of Dracula. Percy, Mary, and Lord Byron spent this summer marveling at the beautiful Swiss countryside, especially walking around Lake Geneva, until a period of especially heavy rain forced them to stay inside. They had begun reading a collection of ghost stories as a group, and Lord Byron proposed a game, in which the 4 of them, including a friend who was also there, would each write their own ghost story. The others wrote theirs in their own time, but Mary was struggling to find the spark of a story. But one night, as Percy and Lord Byron sat talking by the fire, Mary overheard them speaking about the principle of life. At the time, science, especially medical science, was advancing in leaps and bounds, and the men wondered whether the actual threads and origin of life itself would ever be truly understood. Mary got very little sleep that night. Rather, she tossed and turned, images of scientists reaching into the very tendons of life filling her mind. In the introduction to a later version of Frankenstein, Shelley writes about the visions that she saw that night. "I saw the pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion." The next morning, she realized that the fears that plagued her might also horrify others, and began to write out the tale of the sordid scientist, beginning with that dreary November night and the waking of a monster. Mary shared her ghost story with the group, and even the few pages that she had written out were enough to stun them. Percy, who had always wanted Mary to make a name for herself in literature, encouraged her to keep writing, and so, with his help, they published Frankenstein, or A Modern Prometheus, anonymously in 1818. The reception of the novel was certainly varied, with some praising its macabre themes and eloquent prose, and others criticizing it for its morbidity and the absurdness of its premise. Even more criticism came when the public realized that the novel had not, as they had assumed, been written by Percy Shelley, but rather by his wife, who at the time of its writing was still only a teenager. Still, there was something about Mary Shelley's novel that lingered, receiving adaptation after adaptation, until today most people will be somewhat familiar with the name Frankenstein. However, I found that most people have very little familiarity with the actual original novel, so in order to establish a baseline for us to operate off of when we're talking about later adaptations, I'm gonna do my best to summarize the novel here. If you've read the novel in recent memory, you could always skip this section and go to this timestamp, but if you only have a cursory understanding of the original story, or it's been a couple of years since you read it, I highly recommend that you stick around because a lot of the themes that I draw out in this summary are going to come up later on. So without any further ado, let us tell the tale of Frankenstein, or A Modern Prometheus. Our tale of Dr. Frankenstein opens not with the title character, but with one Robert Walton. Through letters that he writes back to his sister in London, we learn of the quest that Robert Walton is on, leading a ship to one of the most treacherous places in the world, the North Pole. The tale is set at the end of the 1700s, so the pole was still largely mysterious, and at this time many explorers had tried or died trying to make their name finding a path through it. Walton is one of those brave adventurers, a man who feels stifled by his everyday life and seeks glory and a name in the frigid waters of the pole. The landscape is beautiful, inspiring Walton to wax poetic on its nature, but it is also desolate and dangerous. As the ice closes in around the ship, locking it in place, the sailors spot something strange off in the distance. A giant man-like creature riding on a sledge. They're too far to identify the creature, but the next day, against all odds, they find another rider and a sledge floating by, stranded on a block of ice. The rider is weak and emaciated, on death's door, but despite all of this, he still demands to know which way they're going before he's willing to come on board. Only upon hearing that they're headed north does he acquiesce, coming aboard and collapsing into a near-death state the second that he begins to warm up. After 2 days of nursing from Walton himself, the stranger gathers enough energy to ask if they had seen anything strange out on the ice lately. When they tell him about the massive creature they'd seen days before, the stranger seems to come alive again. Walton describes a new spirit of life animating the decaying frame of the stranger. He manifested the greatest eagerness to be upon deck to watch for the sledge which had before appeared, but I have persuaded him to remain in the cabin. Slowly, as the ship freezes to a halt, the stranger begins to soften to Walton, seeing him as a kindred spirit. Speaking of freezing to a halt, it is 50 degrees in here today, and I'm cold. They both have an eye for sublime, finding beauty even in nature's cold cruelty. They're similarly educated, acclimatized to society, and seem to have a similar thirst for discovering the undiscovered. Walton, who has often expressed desire for a friend of his own kind, is immediately enraptured by the man's fervor, which he carries across even in his weakened state. Still, there seem to be dark secrets in this stranger's past, and eventually he agrees to tell Walton his life story, even if it's just to warn Walton from going down the same path as him. The real meat of the story begins as we learn that this haggard stranger is none other than Victor Frankenstein. Frankenstein begins with his upbringing, which it seems was overwhelmingly perfect in his eyes. His parents were deeply in love and ensured that their firstborn son, Victor, wanted for nothing in terms of wealth or affection. They had such a surplus of love that they even took in another child, a young girl named Elizabeth. In the original 1818 publication of this story, Victor and Elizabeth were actually first cousins, which is a little bit frowned upon these days, considering what the two get up to later in the novel. But in later editions, Shelley claimed that Elizabeth was just kind of a random destitute child that they picked up, and that she and Victor weren't actually cousins, they just call each other cousins. That It's 1818. What are you gonna do, I guess? Marry your cousin, apparently. That's what you're gonna do. Either way, even as children, Victor and Elizabeth felt an instant connection. Victor's mother had teased him once, saying that Elizabeth was a special gift that she brought home just for him, and his childlike brain latched onto that, saying, "I interpreted her words literally, and looked upon Elizabeth as mine, my more than sister, till death she was to be mine only." Despite the fact that our modern lens may look at this as a bit weird and controlling, Elizabeth was all about it, and the two grew up as best friends and eventually lovers. Another figure of Frankenstein's youth is his schoolmate, Henry Clerval. Clerval is sweet, reliable, and intelligent, and is Frankenstein's constant companion and friend. The three of them spend many happy years together, the untouched innocence of their youth reflected in the Genevan countryside, pure and untainted. In this glowing bubble of youth, Frankenstein grows up to be a very happy but restless man, endlessly intrigued by the universe. Victor thinks of nature as a puzzle, a secret which he desires to divine, and through his studies he discovers the work of ancient occultists and alchemists, such as Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, and Albertus Magnus. When he sees a tree be obliterated by a lightning strike, a scientist explains the process to him, which also reveals that these alchemists and occultists who he admired had been proven utterly wrong by modern science. Though initially hurt by this and driven away from them, he remains entranced by the way that they thought about the world. They didn't bog themselves down in the practicalities or provable realities of science. Rather, they thought much bigger, delving readily into the mysteries of life, death, and unlimited power. Despite his disenchantment with modern thinkers, Frankenstein makes plans to leave Geneva to go study natural philosophy, essentially science, at the German university at Ingolstadt. Before he can depart, though, his beloved Elizabeth falls ill with scarlet fever. She recovers, but Frankenstein's mother, unable to watch her adopted daughter suffer alone, catches the disease, and unfortunately she dies. Her last wish, made while she clutches the hands of Elizabeth and Victor together, is that the two will someday get married. Bogged down by grief, Frankenstein leaves for university, saying goodbye to Elizabeth, to Henry Clerval, and his blissful youth. At Ingolstadt, Frankenstein is immediately put off by the professor of natural philosophy, who mocks him for still following the beliefs of outdated and disproven occultists. However, another professor, the chemist Dr. Walden, approaches Frankenstein with a different idea. He explains the ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little, but have indeed performed miracles. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. Waldman convinces Frankenstein that the godlike power he saw grasped for by Agrippa and his contemporaries had not been eliminated by modern science, but fulfilled. Modern science was making possible the lofty aspirations towards universal power that had first drawn Frankenstein towards science. Frankenstein is set alight with this discovery, but with hindsight, he acknowledges that this was the beginning of his downfall. With grim foreshadowing, he says, "Such were the professor's words, announced to destroy me." From then on, Frankenstein devoured all of the teachings that modern science had to offer. Once he had sucked the textbooks and lectures of Ingolstadt dry, his thirst drove him onward, delving further and further into the greatest mysteries of the world: life, death, and power over them. He spirals obsessively down this rabbit hole, ignoring everything, including letters from his adoring friends and family in Geneva, cloistering himself away in his apartment as he tried to rip apart the very threads of creation. Eventually, he believes himself ready to put his grim studies to work. He will bestow life upon a new creature of his own invention. He outright refuses to go into details about how this process was accomplished, not wanting readers or listeners to fall down the same path as him, but he outlines the vague details, piecing together the parts of dead human bodies in order to create an 8-foot-tall humanoid monster. After toiling away in years of solitude, on one dreary November night, the fated plans of Dr. Frankenstein come to fruition. The being, once a pile of lifeless matter, wakes, and in this moment, Frankenstein's world collapses in on itself. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? His limbs were in proportion. I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriancies only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Pale, malnourished, and horrified by his own deeds, Frankenstein flees from his workroom, leaving the monster to its own devices. He tries to sleep, but obviously he's plagued by nightmares. I'm surprised he was able to get to sleep at all. When he's finally woken by his dreams, it is to the monster standing over him in bed and smiling when Frankenstein wakes up. Despite the fact that the monster has done nothing outwardly threatening thus far, Frankenstein is horrified and repulsed and terrified and flees the apartment altogether. Upon stumbling out onto the streets of Ingolstadt, feeling the sun on his skin for the first time in ages, he runs unexpectedly into none other but his childhood friend, Henry Clerval. Despite Frankenstein's wretched state, his friend greets him gladly. He'd just been granted permission by his father to study at the university and is excited about the idea of once again being with his best friend. Overjoyed but overwhelmed, Frankenstein leads Clerval back to his apartment, where, to his luck, the monster has gone without a trace. Frankenstein is glad of this, and of Clerval's unexpected arrival, but the stress, exhaustion, and fervor of his studies catch up with him all at once, and he collapses, falling into a very ill-fevered state. This is the first of many times that Frankenstein gets so worked up that he just takes himself out, and I'm just saying that if they had gotten this guy a Zoloft prescription and a decent therapist, this whole thing would have been a lot shorter. Frankenstein recovers slowly, with help from Clerval and some pleading letters from Elizabeth. Together they study language and art, avoiding science at Frankenstein's request. Although he does occasionally think about the fact that his monster is just out there on the loose, he's able to put that on the back burner for now. But before they can depart to return to Geneva for the first time in years, Frankenstein receives a letter from his father bearing some very bad news. He reveals that Frankenstein's youngest brother, the innocent and vibrant William, has been found strangled to death. The family, especially Elizabeth, is being consumed alive by grief, and Frankenstein rushes home to Geneva to be with them. Just outside of the city, at the very spot of his brother's death, Frankenstein beholds a terrible sight. It's his monster, still alive 2 years after he had last seen it, standing at the scene of the crime that Frankenstein is now confident he has committed. Frankenstein is immediately taken by guilt. He, after all, had created the monster that had then gone on to kill William. There is undeniably blood on his hands. Finally returning home after 6 years away, Frankenstein enters a grieving household to yet more grief. Without any other evident suspects, the family's kind and faithful servant, Justine, has been accused of the crime. She was found holding a piece of jewelry that Elizabeth had given to William the night before his death, and because of this, she's being put on trial for the murder. Too afraid to try and explain the monster to his family or to the court, Frankenstein watches as Justine is tried and then hanged for his crime. That means his body count is 2 already. Although he's back home, Frankenstein is worse than ever, falling into deep pits of depression. He even considers taking his own life as a way to escape the pain, but doesn't want to put his remaining family members through that. Instead, he goes on long walks through the countryside. The vast and unchanged landscape, the only thing that's able to bring him comfort. It's on one of these retreats that he comes face to face with the embodiment of his suffering, his monster, waiting for him amongst the alpine glaciers. Frankenstein responds immediately with violence, but his monster, who when last they met was only capable of groaning, responds with surprising eloquence. "I expected this reception," said the daemon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things, Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me. Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. Frankenstein responds with yet more threats, entirely hollow threats considering that he's created this monster to be an 8-foot-tall, perfectly powerful specimen and he's just some guy. The monster goes on to inform Frankenstein that it is his responsibility to hear him out. As the monster's creator, it is up to him out of anyone in the world to at least try to listen to and understand him. At last, Frankenstein agrees, following the monster to a cave where he has built up a fire. It's only then that Frankenstein acknowledges that the monster might have a point, and he, as the creator of this creature that he has only ever hated and spurned, may have some responsibility towards it. At this, they sit down, and the monster begins his story. If you're keeping track, that means that Walton is recounting the story that Frankenstein told him as Frankenstein recounts the story that the monster told him. Bear with me. The monster's first feelings were that of confusion, and it's no wonder. He sprang fully formed into a world filled with incomprehensible sensations and sounds that he had no way of understanding. He was alone and baffled. After leaving Frankenstein's apartment, he found himself wandering through the forest, cold, alone, thirsty, and hungry, with no way of understanding what these things meant. Still, he survived, scrounging for roots and berries and odd scraps of clothes. But despite his rude awakening into the world, the monster finds it utterly dazzling. I was delighted when I first discovered that a pleasant sound which often saluted my ears proceeded from the throats of little winged animals. On one memorable occasion, he stumbled across a campfire that had been left behind, and after discovering its ability to give warmth and cook his food, he figured out how to tend to it, keeping it alive for weeks. Eventually, he stumbled across some humans, which he is dismayed to find are terrified of him, driving him away with violence and chasing him out of civilization. Eventually, the monster discovers a small cottage, which, although occupied, has a small shelter built next to it off to the side. He finds it empty and sets himself up there, immensely grateful for the simple pleasures of a clean bed of straw. Although unable to understand human language at first, the monster discovers that this family is, above all, kind. There's the blind father who plays music, and his 2 children, a boy and a girl, who care for him and each other. Despite the love that the family has for each other, the monster learns that they are financially quite poor, and so in order to help the family, he starts gathering firewood for them at night and leaving it on their front porch. The family is delighted by this apparent miracle, and the monster begins performing more and more chores for the family, watching them raptly and referring to them as his cottagers. By carefully listening along, he begins to develop a grasp of human language, and when a beautiful, mysterious woman arrives and makes the family exceedingly happy, he starts to catch on about what their story is. So that would be a story inside of a story inside of a story. And Inception thought they did it first. The family had once been incredibly wealthy, living in Paris, but due to the son falling in love with this beautiful stranger, and some problems with the law, the family had unjustly been exiled to this cottage to live destitute. The woman has arrived to marry the son, and as they teach her to speak and read their language, the monster listens in too and finds his voice. He then stumbles across a satchel of books containing, among other classics, John Milton's Paradise Lost. From these books, he gains a wider understanding of the world, in particular learning about the relationship between a creator and their creation. He finds some identifying papers in the pockets of the coat that he stole from Dr. Frankenstein, and with his newfound ability to read, he begins to realize the realities of his own relationship with his creator. With the poetry of Milton flowing through his mind, he thinks, God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, Frankenstein, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan had his companions to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred. With this loneliness festering, the monster determines that he will someday meet the cottagers face to face, hoping to convince them with his new powers of reason and speech to accept him. After months of contemplation, he decides first to approach the blind man alone, knowing that he can't be repelled by the monster's looks. And at first, things seem to be going pretty well. With the children gone, the blind man welcomes him inside, willing to offer whatever hospitality he can. The monster is almost too nervous to speak, but works up the courage to tell the man that he is lonely and destitute and seeking the comfort of a friend, but he's worried that this friend will reject him due to his appearance. Confirming the monster's highest hopes, the man assures him that it's the soul of the person that matters, and not their outside appearance. This all goes up in flames, literally, when the children come home to find their father seated with a monster. The women scream and flee or faint from fear, and the son drives the monster away, fearing that his father is endangered. The monster is broken by this rejection, and upon learning that the cottagers moved away in fear of his return, he burns the building to the ground. My protectors had departed and broken the only link that held me to the world. For the first time, the feelings of revenge and hatred filled my bosom, and I did not strive to control them. But allowing myself to be borne away by the stream, I bent my mind towards injury and death. With nothing left to lose, he sets his sights towards Geneva, which is the one place that he knows Frankenstein may be. Outside of the city, he finds the boy William, and upon learning that he is related to Victor Frankenstein, he's filled with rage. He strangles William to death on the spot, hoping to cause as much damage to Frankenstein as possible. He then took the jewelry that William was wearing and placed it on the body of a girl sleeping in a barn. A girl who turned out to be Justine, out late looking for William. With his tale told, the monster goes on to explain what he wants from his creator. He wants Frankenstein to do it again, to create another creature, a woman who could be his constant companion. He swears that if Frankenstein will fulfill this barest responsibility, the monster will leave, taking his mate to South America, never to be seen again. Yeah, South America really got the short end of the stick there. Victor is moved by this plea, though he is still sickened by the monster. In the end, he decides that he had no right to withhold from the monster the small portion of happiness which was yet in his power to bestow. Moved by the reasonable eloquence of the monster, Frankenstein agrees to this task, and it's only once he's alone that he realizes what he's agreed to. Frankenstein puts off the job for as long as possible, though he is constantly aware that the monster is probably there watching his progress. He's consumed by guilt and anxiety, and the only comfort that he finds is in Elizabeth, who's insisting that they marry soon. Frankenstein, however, wants to wait until after the monster is done and dealt with, and he tells Elizabeth that they can marry when he returns. He needs to learn more about female anatomy before he can complete this job, and so he makes plans to travel to London, which was apparently the female anatomy hub of the 18th century. Elizabeth is sad to see him go and insists that he not travel alone. Clerval insists on joining him, and despite the evil intent of the journey, Frankenstein is delighted to be traveling the countryside with his best friend. After obtaining the research that he needs, Frankenstein leaves Clerval behind to go out to a remote Scottish island in order to complete this task in solitude. When he had first created the monster, Frankenstein had been fueled by a number of passions. He had been young and hopeful, and convinced that he could become like one of the ancient occultists of old, capable of unlimited power. But without this haze of passion, the work was incredibly painful to him. Now Frankenstein was all too aware of the atrocities he was committing, of the wrongness of his work, but the deaths of William and Justine and the potential for more harm weighed heavily on him. After weeks of solitary work on this island and with the task near completion, one night, Frankenstein sits back and considers what he's doing. He realizes with dawning horror that this new creature is going to be just as unpredictable as the first. She had made no promises to vanish into the wilderness. Perhaps she would want to remain in civilization, or perhaps she too would despise and fear the monster, sending him down a path of further violence. Or perhaps the worst alternative, she and the monster could procreate, releasing more of Frankenstein's monsters into the world. He wonders all of the sudden if he's only making things much, much worse, if future generations of humans would forever despise him for releasing this plague upon them. He looks up to see the monster standing in the window with nothing but malice in his eyes. Frankenstein snaps and tears his new creation limb from limb, breaking his vow to the monster. The monster screams with rage, turning on him, reminding him of his responsibility. Remember that I have power. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey. When Frankenstein refuses, he swears that Frankenstein will never truly be happy. He will have his revenge on the creator who created such a wretched thing. The monster leaves with one final ominous warning. I shall be with you on your wedding night. Not long after, Frankenstein receives a letter from Clerval requesting that they meet up again, and so he collects together his lab equipment and collects together the remains of his second creation, sailing out in the dead of night to dispose of it in the ocean. Upon purging the evidence of his dark experimentation, Frankenstein is overwhelmed with relief. Certainly, he's still in danger, and he believes that he may be killed on his wedding night. But the moral weight of his crime has been lifted, and he sits back on the boat, falling asleep to the rocking of the waves. Frankenstein wakes on the boat to find that the winds are too strong for him to head back to shore. The boat has been ravaged, carried far out to sea, and he worries that he may have been pulled out into the middle of the Atlantic, where he'll die soon of hunger and thirst. These worries are a bit overkill though, because in just a couple of hours the wind changes and he gets brought to a seaside town. However, upon landing ashore, the townspeople immediately take him in for questioning. A body has been found strangled to death, and they believe that a man on a boat committed the crime. Frankenstein obviously knows he's not guilty, but he begins to suspect that his monster may be. In order to try and provoke a reaction of guilt from Frankenstein, they bring him to the body, where he sees that it is Henry Clerval, strangled to death by Frankenstein's monster just the night before. True to character, Frankenstein collapses at this realization, falling incredibly ill with fever and guilt. His father travels across the country to nurse him, and although there is a trial, there's not enough evidence to mark him as guilty for the murder, and so he and his father return to Geneva, with Frankenstein worse than ever. Knowing it may result in his demise, Frankenstein continues with the wedding plans, believing that that night he will either kill the monster or die trying. Although Elizabeth worries for his declining health, she's overjoyed by the return of Frankenstein and his father, and she is determined not to let the grief of all of these deaths in the family ruin their happiness. At last, the wedding takes place, and the couple sweeps off to their honeymoon cottage, radiantly happy and, in Frankenstein's case, armed to the teeth. Fully prepared, or so he thinks, for the monster to fulfill his promise, Frankenstein stalks the halls while Elizabeth sleeps. I discovered no trace of him, and was beginning to conjecture that some fortunate chance had intervened to prevent the execution of his menaces, when suddenly I heard a shrill and dreadful scream. It came from the room into which Elizabeth had retired. As I heard it, the whole truth rushed into my mind. My arms dropped. The motion of every muscle and fiber was suspended. She was there, lifeless and inanimate, thrown across the bed, her head hanging down and her pale and distorted features half covered by her hair. Frankenstein had failed to understand the monster's true meaning, and had paid the greatest price for it. His Elizabeth was gone, and his happiness was ended. His father, who is apparently a lot like his son, falls ill shortly after receiving this news and dies soon after. Frankenstein at last owns up to what he's done, telling a local magistrate about the monster, begging for their help in getting his vengeance. But of course, they don't believe him. Though weak and exhausted by the pain that he's endured, Frankenstein swears to get his vengeance all the same. Revenge kept me alive. I dared not die and leave my adversary in being. I was reserved for vengeance. Frankenstein leaves Geneva one last time, tracking the monster across all of Europe. The monster, thrilled by the chase, leaves clues so that Frankenstein can follow him, sometimes even leaving food behind in order to sustain him. It seems that both creator and creation have nothing left but to pursue each other, trapped in a cycle of unobtainable revenge. The chase leads further and further north until, just shy of the North Pole, Frankenstein has almost caught up to his monster. When the creature was in sight, just a day or two from their final confrontation, the ice broke, stranding Frankenstein on a float, drifting helplessly into the jaws of death. It was there that he was found by Walton, and there where Frankenstein's portion of this tale ends. Walton is horrified by the events described, but he also doesn't believe that Frankenstein could have made it up. At this point, he sees even more of himself in Frankenstein than before, and wishes fruitlessly that he could have been friends with the younger Frankenstein, who was young and not bogged down by such a tragic life. They're interrupted by one of Walton's crew, who begs Walton to promise to turn them back around and head back to London as soon as they break out of the ice. They all believe that if they push forward, they'll either be crushed by glaciers or die of frostbite. Frankenstein has enough vigor left to reprimand the crew for this suggestion. He accuses them of cowardice, of not being willing to sacrifice for the glory of discovery. It seems that for all of his guilt and self-pity, Victor Frankenstein has failed to take the moral from his own story. The crew is temporarily moved by this speech, but once the ice does break, they come back to Walton, once again begging for them to sail to safety in London. Walton at last agrees, and they prepare to turn back. Frankenstein dies before they're able to continue their journey, worn down by illness and frailty. With his last words, he warns Walton, "Seek happiness and tranquility, and avoid ambition, even if it be only the apparently innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries." Yet, why do I say this? I have myself been blasted in these hopes. Yet another may succeed. Just a few days later, Walton is startled to hear a noise coming from the room where Frankenstein's corpse lay. Upon running into the room, he finds the monster from Frankenstein's tale, bent weeping over the body of his creator. Walton is almost moved to pity, listening as the monster laments his turn to evil and now his utter loneliness and desolation. Once I falsely hoped to meet with beings who, pardoning my outward form, would love me for the excellent qualities which I was capable of bringing forth. But now, vice has degraded me beneath the meanest animal. No crime, no mischief, no malignity, no misery can be found comparable to mine. When I call over the frightful catalogue of my deeds, I cannot believe that I am he whose thoughts were once filled with sublime and transcendent visions of the beauty and the majesty of goodness. But it is even so. The fallen angel becomes a malignant devil. I am alone. Despite his self-described evilness, the monster goes on to dismiss the worst of Frankenstein's fears, that he would go on to commit more atrocities. Instead, he plans to travel all the way to the North Pole, and there he will build himself a funeral pyre. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly, and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will surely not think thus. Farewell. Frankenstein's monster leaves the ship, and the novel ends. The tragedy of Dr. Frankenstein complete. The tale of Dr. Frankenstein and his ill-begotten monster is a true Gothic horror, which means that it may not be the type of horror that we're familiar with today. Frankenstein, rather, reads as a tragedy. It preys on a much deeper human fear. Through pages of verbose and twisting prose, we watch a man as he falls from the heights of joy and discovery to the pits of utter despair and agony. His obsession with the pursuit of knowledge, his isolation from fellow man, has left him delusional and grasping for godlike power, which he absolutely fails to achieve. We watch as he damns himself to a cold and lonely death, unsure even on his deathbed whether or not he has doomed humanity to a fate too terrible to imagine. Obviously, this story may not be the story that a lot of people who know Frankenstein are familiar with. Later versions of this tale would take the original story and twist it to suit new tastes in horror media. But before we move forward to the monster's next evolution, let's look back, past Frankenstein, to the novel's alternate title, the modern Prometheus. Prometheus is a creature of ancient Greek myth, one of the titans who ruled over Earth before the Olympian gods took over. There are many different interpretations of Prometheus as a character, including one which has him literally creating mankind with his hands, forming them out of clay. With that context, it's very easy to see parallels between Prometheus and Frankenstein, as they are both the creators of a new race. However, we find a much more interesting comparison in a play that the Shelleys were known to have been reading around the time of Frankenstein's writing, called Prometheus Bound. The play is believed to have been written around the 5th century BCE by the famous Greek playwright Aeschylus. Aeschylus is a really important figure in ancient Greek playwriting, credited with the idea of having two actors on stage at the same time. The play follows the title character, Prometheus, as he has been imprisoned following a fallout with the Olympian gods. Before the story of the play begins, Prometheus is actually one of the people that helped Zeus come into his power, but now that Zeus is in control of everything, he's bristling under his tyrannical rule. He particularly despises Zeus's plans to eliminate humankind altogether, and so in order to save them, he gives humankind the gift of fire. With this gift came enlightenment itself, as he taught them art, science, and philosophy. Out of love for humankind, he has enlightened and saved them. And for this defiance against the gods, he has, as the title suggests, been bound to a distant mountain to suffer. The play is stationary, as characters like Oceanus and Hermes come in to discuss Prometheus's fate with him. From his bonds, he laments the injustice that he's suffering, dispenses advice, and overall just refuses to regret what he's done. His visitors warn him of his fate. There will be a flood of natural disasters, and then Prometheus himself will have a bird descend upon him and peck out his internal organs while he is alive and watching over and over again for the rest of eternity. But despite all of this, he refuses to back down. As Zeus's rage and wrath fall upon him, Prometheus stands strong. He calls upon his mother, the earth goddess Gaia, saying, "You see me here and see my lot. Injustice." He vanishes, defiant to the end, in believing that what he has done is right. Meanwhile, Frankenstein, as the modern Prometheus, tells a very different tale. Frankenstein's creative process was, at its root, selfish and irresponsible. Prometheus brought the spark of life to humanity out of love and pity. Frankenstein did it just to prove that he could. He has no understanding of the implications of his act, as can be seen by the rejection of the creature that he created, who, although hideous, is his responsibility. It isn't until years have passed since its creation and following William's death that he at last admits, "For the first time also, I felt what the duties of a creator to his creature were." This touch of goodwill is short-lived though. He spurns and rejects the creature, refusing to give it any companionship, even his own. Whereas Prometheus dares to pity and abandon creation, the human race, at great personal cost, and despite the fact that he is not its physical creator, his modernized counterpart Frankenstein fails to exercise such moral responsibility for the single life he creates because he regards creativity as an abstraction. This irresponsible, loveless creation, this role as the modern Prometheus, is at the heart of the novel. And in the end, while Prometheus vanishes believing that what he's done is just, Frankenstein dies knowing he has committed a great injustice upon mankind. Unfortunately, this is a theme that is often erased from later iterations of the story, which has a great impact on the moral themes of the tale. Luckily, there is one version of the story that I would propose cuts back to the heart of this issue, and closes the wound of loveless creation first opened by Mary Shelley's modern Prometheus 200 years ago. But we'll save that one for the end. We come back to Frankenstein's story at the turn of the 20th century and the birth of cinema. Since its conception, the emerging medium seemed like the perfect place for horror. There's something very dreamlike about film, especially those early silent movies. And often the lines of science fiction, fantasy, and horror were blurred in order to draw audiences in. The very first adaptation of Frankenstein to film was in 1910. It's only 16 minutes and only covers the very vaguest notion of the plot points from the book, but it seemed to fascinate audiences. The scene that particularly caught their attention was the one where the monster rises out of a pit of seething chemicals. Its rudimentary special effects seemed to fascinate audiences, and although the nature of the film meant that they had to remove most of the actual plot and theming from the book, this idea of the man-made monster stuck around. Films advanced rapidly from this point, and by 1931 we were seeing a new invention implemented: sound in film. That year, Universal Pictures utilized this new technology to create the horror film Dracula to massive success. It was an adaptation of a stage play, which in turn had been adapted from the original classic Gothic horror novel by Bram Stoker. It turned a huge profit and fascinated audiences with its unique mix of melodrama and mystery to spin a truly ghastly tale. In order to follow up this smashing success, Universal Pictures immediately began production on another horror classic, Frankenstein. Originally, they wanted this movie to be as close to Dracula as possible, including trying to cast Dracula's star, Bela Lugosi, as the monster, but when he refused, instead they brought in the soon-to-be horror great Boris Karloff. The film was released in 1931, and just like Dracula, it had been based off of a stage play. The play, written by Peggy Webling in the 1920s, made some fundamental changes to Shelley's original story, most notably turning the monster from an eloquent, philosophical character into one that was brutish and childish. This characteristic would then be carried into the Universal adaptation. In the film, they rename Victor to Henry Frankenstein, a change apparently made to make him more approachable. With the help of his assistant Fritz, we see Frankenstein robbing graves, cutting down hanged bodies, and piecing them together in his ominous stony watchtower. However, due to the fumbling error of Fritz, they accidentally put a brain in the creature that is considered abnormal. Frankenstein brings the monster to life with an array of spinning equipment and ominous levers, and most iconically, a passing storm. In a scene that has gone down in cinema history, the creature wakes.
It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
The monster turns out unable to speak and barely able to walk, but he's still seen as an antagonist by Fritz. Fritz provokes the monster repeatedly with fire until the monster snaps and kills him. Frankenstein, distressed by this and by his fevered work leading up to this point, collapses exhausted and is brought home by his fiancée Elizabeth and his childhood best friend, who is of course named Victor, because that's not confusing at all. Meanwhile, the monster escapes, finding a little girl to play with and then accidentally drowning her in a scene that was quite controversial at the time, and earning the wrath of the local townspeople. With Frankenstein recovered, he and Elizabeth make plans for their wedding, but these plans are interrupted when the monster returns. A mob is chasing after him, and the monster kidnaps Frankenstein, bringing him to the top of an old windmill. The mob arrives to burn the windmill down, and Frankenstein barely escapes with his life. Frankenstein, which was a rousing success, was quickly followed up in 1935 by its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, which picks up right where the last one left off. As it turns out, the monster is not dead and continues his adventures around the countryside, saving a shepherdess and being shot for the trouble, and stumbling into the cottage of a blind old man. The blind man, unable to be repelled by his evil looks, is the first person to show the monster any kindness, and he gives him food and drink and a cigar, which he really loves. But this all falls apart when the villagers see him and drive him away. Meanwhile, Frankenstein is approached by another scientist who wants him to continue his dark experimentation. The scientist finds the original monster and uses it to threaten and basically blackmail Frankenstein into creating another one. This time it will be female, and it will be a companion to the first monster, his Bride of Frankenstein. The title. Reluctantly, Frankenstein goes along with this, and together they bring to life the Bride of Frankenstein. However, these efforts are fruitless, as she's frightened by the monster and screams upon seeing him. The monster realizes that he's doomed to be alone forever and tells Frankenstein to leave and go be happy, before pulling a switch that kills him, his new bride, and the doctor. I'm not a scientist, so I wouldn't know, but is it par for the course for labs to have just a kill switch installed that destroys the entire building? Is that something scientists are doing these days? As you can see, this is a far cry from Mary Shelley's original story. But that really shouldn't discredit the movies themselves, as well as the ones that follow this, which I heard are also pretty good. They're honestly a marvel in early cinema in terms of the scale and execution of their productions, and the writing of the films is made much more interesting by the fact that these were created pre-Hays Code in early Hollywood. I could, to be honest, talk about these movies a lot more than I'm able to here, and I probably will write some little mini articles on my Patreon. But for now, we will focus on the through line for this video. The most fundamental change made in Universal's Frankenstein, I would say, is in the nature of the monster. Shelley's monster was incredibly close to humans in all but appearance. He was reasonable, well-read, and philosophic, and most importantly, he was capable of recognizing his own wrongness. He knew why he was rejected by all of humanity, and because of this, the narrative focus was put back onto the scientist that created him and put him in this damnable state. However, Universal's monster, while certainly capable of drawing out pity, has no way of blaming his creator. If anything, he's left to blame those who are outright violent to him, like Fritz or the villagers. But his lack of capacity for reason, his inherently abnormal brain, means that we don't see him as a reflection of his creator. Frankenstein is able to make it out of this one scot-free, and the monster even realizes at the end of Bride of Frankenstein that Frankenstein should go off and be with Elizabeth and be happy. Sure, he's mad, he's the face of the mad scientist archetype, but he's able to shirk the blame. After all, it was his assistant, and not him, that placed the abnormal brain into the creature. For all we know, if Frankenstein had been given the right brain, he might have turned out as a perfectly upright citizen. Universal's story decentralizes Frankenstein as the villain of the narrative, and instead turns it into a story warning against the fear of other. It's a tale of a creature that is almost foolishly innocent being turned by cruelty into a monster. And it was no doubt very resonant at the time, with post-World War I concerns about the loss of innocence in the face of cruelty. Universal's Frankenstein has, for all intents and purposes, lost the modern Prometheus of it all, the delicate discussion about a creator and their creation. And since the Universal Frankenstein films were basically the blueprint for every Frankenstein to follow, we will see the trickle-down effect of this through subsequent adaptations. The next major adaptation that I want to discuss is The Curse of Frankenstein, created in 1957 by Hammer Films Productions. Hammer was a British production company known for revitalizing the horror film genre in the 50s and 60s, and The Curse of Frankenstein was to be the first of their full-color horror productions. It stars Peter Cushing, one of Hammer Films' biggest stars, and an early in his career Christopher Lee, and it was a major building block for a new wave of horror films. The film goes to great lengths to set itself apart from the Universal films, both probably as a matter of pride and also to avoid copyright infringement, and so it took on a very different angle to the story. In it, Frankenstein, who has once again reclaimed the name Victor, is aided by his childhood tutor, Paul Kremp, in creating his creature. Frankenstein is the epitome of the evil scientist in this movie, sleeping with his maid Justine while his fiancée Elizabeth eats alone in the other room, and killing a distinguished professor by throwing him down the stairs in order to steal his brain. Unfortunately, Paul Kremp turns against him, and in an effort to halt the experiment, he smashes the brain in its glass jar. For some reason, Frankenstein decides to use this brain anyway, glass and all, so the resulting monster is, not great. It attacks Frankenstein, escapes, and then goes on to kill a blind man in the woods. The monster is captured by Frankenstein, but the danger is far from over. With Paul gone, he spirals, sacrificing Justine, who's just told him that she's pregnant, to the monster, and almost getting Elizabeth killed. The monster then burns to death, but Frankenstein is imprisoned after shooting Elizabeth in the shoulder, trying to save her. No one, not even Paul Kremp, comes to his aid while he languishes in jail, and at the end of the film, Frankenstein is led off to the guillotine. This film, while again remarkable for its time and quite genuinely enjoyable, further brutalizes the story. Instead of weaving the tale of the modern Prometheus or of innocence lost in the face of cruelty, It tells the tale of a truly evil, corrupt, mad scientist. And this is likely an attempt to capture the fear of socially irresponsible scientists in a post-atomic age. And this is interesting to me because I think that Shelley's story would have actually done a pretty good job of speaking to this theme. At the heart of the tale is a scientist mad with ambition. In his fervor to create, to discover, he's failed to think through the ramifications of his acting. And if that doesn't speak to post-atomic America, I don't know what does. Instead, The Curse of Frankenstein shows us a scientist who is cursed by little more than wanton cruelty. He knows that the brain is damaged, but decides to use it anyway. There's none of the plausible deniability that we get from Universal's Frankenstein. The monster himself, due to the psychosis induced by his glass brain, is an irredeemable, unpitiable ghoul. And in that, I think of him as a reflection of his creator. There is a hunger for blood and pain that will only be satiated by him suffering a sudden and painful death. Our next version is a bit of a tone shift from previous adaptations, but nonetheless it shows an important step forward in the Frankenstein mythos. And that is the 1974 Mel Brooks comedy, Young Frankenstein. The film stars Gene Wilder and features other big names like Marty Feldman and Gene Hackman. It straddles that line between parody and homage, lovingly tracing the familiar lines of the Universal Frankenstein, even down to being shot in black and white. It tells the tale of Dr. Frankenstein, who is desperate to escape from his grandfather Victor's mad shadow. But his normal American life is interrupted when he inherits an estate in Transylvania and finds himself falling down a familiar rabbit hole. He's aided by Igor, the grandfather of his grandfather's lab assistant, and finds his grandfather's writings. From there, he creates his own monster, including, of course, accidentally, an abnormal brain. Many events play out from the Universal film basically beat by beat, including him finding a little girl in the forest and stumbling into the cottage of an old blind man. Of course, it's all parodied, including the blind man pouring soup into the monster's lap and lighting his thumb on fire instead of his cigar. However, the story takes an interesting turn when Frankenstein comes face to face with his captured monster. After trying and failing to escape from the locked room, Frankenstein tries another tactic and appeals to the monster's humanity by showing it love. He promises to treat it well, to give it human company, and to treat it to function like a human being. They put on a grand performance in front of a room of scientists, showing that all this monster needed was a little bit of love and guidance.
Different types who wear a day coat, pants with stripes, or cutaway coat, perfect fits.
Of course, this all goes to hell when the monster is startled and lashes out, and the mob instantly descends on him. Hijinks occur, including the monster and Frankenstein's former fiancée, Elizabeth, sharing a, romance.
Oh my,
And culminating in Frankenstein melding his brain with that of the monster. In the end, the monster learns how to become a part of high society, and Frankenstein learns how to become a little bit more monstrous. Although Frankenstein's motivations are certainly selfish, as he wants to both advance his own career and remain alive, there is a kindness and tenderness here towards the monster that we haven't seen since Mary Shelley modernized Prometheus. This care nearly has the desired effect, civilizing the monster for a time, but in the end, he is doomed to remain just that. His brain is abnormal, and until it has been melded with the superior intellect of Dr. Frankenstein, the monster stands no chance at living a good life. Young Frankenstein shows us two very interesting things. First of all, it solidifies the modern Frankenstein myth. It tells us what needs to be in the story in order for it to be recognizable as Frankenstein. The mad doctor, the dumb assistant, the mob, the down-on-his-luck monster. To many, the version of the story parodied by Young Frankenstein, pulling from both the Universal monster movies and the wider cultural concept of Frankenstein, is Frankenstein, no matter what Mary Shelley's original novel has to say about it. But Young Frank also shows an awareness that this is not all that the Frankenstein story is doomed to be. It's not just the evil monster and the evil scientist doomed to a tragic downfall over and over again. There could be a happy ending to this story. Our next film is an interesting anomaly, and it is the 1994 film titled Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The film is positively star-studded, starring the famous Shakespearean adapter Kenneth Branagh as Frankenstein, as well as Robert De Niro as the monster and Helena Bonham Carter as Elizabeth, and it's stated to have the loftiest of goals: to truly adapt Mary Shelley's novel. And in their defense, they definitely do come the closest, at least plot-wise. They even have the framing device of Robert Walton in the North Pole, which is a really nice change. However, the 1994 film makes some very particular changes, including, to me at least most notably, a scene in which, trigger warning, this is horrifying, he attaches Elizabeth's head to Justine's body and then waltzes her around the room for a while like a grotesque flesh puppet. Awesome. There's a particular emphasis on gore and violence and the gritty details of Frankenstein's experimentation that is all but absent from the original story. This is likely, in part, an attempt to make the story more overtly horrific. As one essay I read puts it, horror is a cultural construct redefined by each new generation. Because of this, what was once considered horrific in the early 19th century has lost that same horrific appeal nowadays. The original story reads more as a sort of philosophical tragedy, whereas modern audiences have come to expect certain things from a horror movie, especially a Frankenstein horror movie. The added gore and violence is probably then an attempt to appeal to modern audiences while still telling the original story. And this was, in my opinion, a bad move. Those who were expecting a faithful adaptation of the book were disappointed to see an undue amount of blood, gore, and a weird focus on death. Those who only knew Frankenstein as his modern mythic counterpart were disappointed not to see the creature that had been cemented by the likes of Young Frankenstein. Succinctly put, Branagh's Frankenstein attempted to please every appetite and succeeded in satisfying none. There is one final version that I'd like to discuss, that I believe manages to capture all of the moral complexity of the modern Prometheus, along with the modern conceptions that we've developed of the Frankenstein myth, and that is the 2012 masterpiece, Frankenweenie. Frankenweenie is a 3D animated children's film created by Tim Burton. Burton's style is iconic, combining fantasy with gothic whimsy, along with a lot of traditional elements of horror, and Frankenweenie is no different. It tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, a young boy who's a bit of a recluse, preferring to stay at home and make movies or play with his science equipment, rather than, getting out and doing sports. His sole companion is his adorable pet dog, Sparky. While Victor is being forced to play baseball by his concerned father, Sparky goes to catch the ball, runs out into traffic, and is killed. I'm not gonna lie, I watched this with my housemates, and we all forgot somehow that the dog was gonna have to die, so this scene, brutalized us. I cried. I cried at Frankenweenie. Victor is likewise destroyed by the loss of his best friend, but finds hope when his science teacher shows the class how electricity can make the muscles of dead animals move. Inspired, Victor digs up Sparky's remains and, using all of his scientific equipment, reanimates him in a scene that is a clear nod to the Universal films. When they find out that Sparky is alive again, his classmates see an opportunity to win the upcoming science fair. They try to use Victor's technology on other dead animals, but it malfunctions, turning these animals into mutants. After these mutant creatures nearly destroy the entire town, Sparky saves the day, but is killed in the process again. The townspeople, who were once terrified of Sparky, see his bravery and Victor's love for him, and so they jump him with their car batteries. Back for a second time, Victor and Sparky celebrate, and Sparky even gets a Bride of Frankenstein dog girlfriend. The film manages to perfectly encapsulate everything that one would expect to get from a Frankenstein movie. There's mad scientists, monsters, lightning, and mobs, but at the heart of it is one very, very important theme: love. When Victor asks his science teacher why the experiment only worked on Sparky and not on any of these other animals, the teacher asks him,
"The first time did you love your experiment?"
Yes.
I don't think that's how the scientific method works, but we'll let it slide because it's cute. The only reason Victor's experiment worked, and the reason it didn't work for any other animals, is because of Victor's beautiful love for Sparky. He didn't create him out of a desire for knowledge, out of a frantic chasing of something that nature put outside of his grasp for a reason. He brought Sparky back because he loved that dog so much that he would break the laws of nature to be with him again. All of these Frankensteins past were missing one thing when they created their creature. They were not created for the creature's sake, but for their own. They assumed pridefully that knowledge is a higher good than love or sympathy. That is the modern in the modern Prometheus. It's bestowing upon a being all of the elements of humanity, the art, the passion, the love, the philosophy, and forcing him to be alone. Not guiding him, not shaping him, not loving him. Both Victor Frankenstein of the 2012 film Frankenweenie and the Greek titan Prometheus are, as Percy Shelley once put it, the type of the highest perfection of moral and intellectual nature, impelled by the purest and truest motives to the best and noblest ends. Thus, the Curse of Frankenstein is ended, and the creator at last put it rights to its creation. Frankenstein is a story that has lingered in our culture because it has something to say. Each of these versions asks very important questions of us, like the responsibility of a creator to their creation, or whether or not it's a good idea to put glass in a guy's brain. It's not a good idea, but now we know. But I think what's so beautiful about watching this story be handed down from generation to generation of storytellers is that we are all able to use this modern myth of the mad scientist and the monster to tell the story that we need to tell. We infuse them with our own meaning from our own time when we put them into our own words, all the way from Aeschylus in the 5th century to Tim Burton in 2012. Looking at these stories, you can feel the deep-rooted human instinct for storytelling, tugging at you from ages past, imploring you to make new stories out of the old and to say something that matters. And that's what this new series on this channel is all about. I plan on taking other icons like Santa or Alice in Wonderland and examining their cultural context and the way that these stories have transformed from their original source material all the way to the modern myths that they are. These videos won't be super frequent because I want to be able to give these stories the time and space that they deserve, but I plan on running, once every couple of weeks along with my Foundations of Fantasy series, which I will also be starting soon, as part of a long-term plan to expand this channel to talking all about stories and the way that they're told. Believe it or not, considering the runtime of this video, I actually had more that I wanted to talk about that I wasn't able to fit in this. Over the past 2 months, I went from never having read or watched anything Frankenstein themed to having watched all of these movies in the past week and having read the novel twice. So to be honest, I've thought of pretty much nothing else for the last month. I even forced my friend to have a Frankenweenie themed birthday party this weekend because I needed a reason to watch it. I made her a cake though, so. But basically, if you want to read or hear me discuss any other parts of Frankenstein, such as other themes that have been passed down from adaptation to adaptation and transformed, you should check out my Patreon. It's linked right below, and my patrons are the ones who make videos like this possible, and I'm hugely, hugely thankful to them for supporting this channel. Please comment below with your favorite version of Frankenstein and why it's Frankenweenie, and consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Watching this community grow has been an absolute privilege, and I'm really, really lucky to have a community that supports me in making the videos that I want to make. But don't worry, next week's video will be about the Lord of the Rings. Thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you have a spectacularly spooky Halloween and a very happy, hobbity day.